And welcome to this afternoon session entitled Warning, Risk and Resilience. We've had 460 people sign up for this event. It's by far the biggest one of the week. I'm not surprised. It's going to be the most interesting. We've got the best panelists. We've got the best chair, of course. And I think there's going to be about 200 odd people that are going to log on to this. The event is being live streamed via the War Studies YouTube channel, and you can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag global shocks. So just to introduce the session itself and then introduce the speakers. The session itself is going to focus on intelligence and security, and intelligence and security are part of the biggest elements of what we do within War Studies. It's our biggest MA program. It's something we're very, very proud of. We have a very active research group, and all four of our speakers today are visiting fellows within the intelligence and security research group. One of the things that's been visible in the intelligence literature is the importance of warning, the importance of resilience, and the different contexts in which this arises, whether it's counterterrorism or other things. The panel will explore some of these questions relative to the role of intelligence for planning, for managing, and resilience in the face of developing threats. We're going to have the four speakers all speak to start with, and we'll have questions at the end. If people do have questions, please put them into the Q&A function. We will then collate them and ask them on your behalf. But it would be great to get a sense of where people are tuning in from. So when you put your questions into that Q&A function, please start by giving us your name, tell us your university or which country you're in or something else about you, and so we can get a sense of just where this is being broadcast to. So our first speaker is Professor Sir David Omand. Sir David has been a visiting professor in war studies for over 10 years now. Prior to that, he served a long career in the government, working as director of GCHQ and security and intelligence coordinator in the Cabinet Office. And I'm going to pass over to David to speak first. David.
Thanks very much, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to address the question about how we can learn to be less surprised by surprise itself. I mean, we can ask ourselves, should we have been so surprised by the serious outbreak of COVID-19 in the UK and indeed its lethal consequences? And this takes me to the purpose of having intelligence. The purpose of having intelligence is to enable better, more timely decisions by reducing the ignorance of the decision takers. That doesn't mean giving exact forecasts of how a situation may develop. Intelligence analysts and indeed scientists are not fortune tellers, nor does it involve simplifying decisions. My experience is that intelligence analysis often shows that an issue is far more complex than current politics might suggest. But governments do need a system for assessing the significance and the import of events that are happening now, and they need what I call strategic notice of possible developments of serious concern to our well-being. And that's as true for significant possible developments in the fields of science and technology, the environment, public health, as it is in the traditional worlds of international relations, defense, and security. Now, when information reaches us, whether it's from open sources or secret sources, there are four conceptually distinct mental processes we need to go through to arrive at a satisfactory assessment and key judgments to inform decisions on what to do. And together, these four stages form a model of intelligence analysis that I call the C's model: situational awareness, explanation, estimation, and strategic notice. And that last one, strategic notice, is there to cue the whole system to possible developments that are worthy of attention or precautionary measures to take now. So if I start with situational awareness, this is answering questions about what, when, where, and who. A timely assessment of what is really happening is really the first step. It's an invaluable step in the response to disputed events that may have strategic consequences. And often today, that situational awareness will come from large data sets. Just think, for example, about the mobile telephony communications data from mobile telephones, what, when, where, and who. The second stage, though, is explanation, because data by itself is dumb. You have to add meaning. And this is answering the policymakers' questions about why and what for. And this step is likely to involve using the principles of Bayesian causal inference to test competing hypotheses on different assumptions of why we are observing what we do, and choosing the explanatory hypothesis that best fits the available facts, and indeed with the least evidence against it. And analysts have to be prepared to infer causality, working backwards from the evidence to the most likely cause of it, and to assess the motives of those they are writing about. Then, if you have a good explanation, you can hazard an estimate of how a situation may evolve, at least evolve in the short term. The term prediction is one that professional analysts prefer to avoid, since it implies a kind of point precision and path dependency that the sort of models of the real world we have can rarely support. But if you do have a suitable explanatory model, the analyst can provide estimates of how likely it is that events may unfold in different ways and answer those key questions about what next or where next. And we've seen that process unfold before us through SAGE in the COVID-19 modeling. It's important in this that analysts do not only give their most likely estimate, but also highlight scenarios where the consequences would be severe if they did actually happen, and nothing was done to prevent them, such as the modeling based on a reasonable worst case of COVID-19 that showed on the 26th of February that without stringent containment measures, there could be 370,000 deaths in the UK by the end of next year. I observe here, it was not until the 23rd of March before the Prime Minister announced the stay-at-home policy. Now, these three steps to obtain situational awareness, explanation, and to estimate how things might develop are in a sense all applying Bayesian inference to data. There's a final important step in the SEAS model, and that's to provide strategic notice, which involves a different mode of thinking. Strategic notice is flagging up possible strategic developments that may lie sometimes well over the long-term horizon, raising questions of the whatever might we expect next and how could we best prepare for it type. Often, given the pressure of events, we know that policymakers don't have the time to spend thinking about what might be done to invest in resilience against long-term risks. And politicians in general tend to be, by profession, short-sighted, being bounded by the horizon of the next or next but one election or budget. Now, over generations, the UK has evolved world-class processes through the Joint Intelligence Committee, the JIC, and now the National Security Council for using secret intelligence on issues such as terrorism and malign state activity. There's direct drive between the JIC and the Prime Minister and his senior cabinet colleagues, since the chair of the JIC and the heads of the intelligence agencies attend the National Security Council. A modern approach to national security as a whole needs comparable and compatible processes for all the serious global hazards that may lie ahead for the British people and British interests. The processes for identifying and managing serious natural hazards, including human and animal disease, major accidents, flooding, solar flares, and all the rest of it, are part of the National Security Council framework. There's a published National Risk Register. The National Security Strategy identifies from it the top priority risks. During my time as UK Intelligence and Security Coordinator after 9/11, a mutated flu pandemic occupied the top right-hand corner of the Strategic Notice Risk Matrix. Of all the threats and risks, it posed the most lethal combination of impact and probability. When you have such strategic notice, that should be the trigger for investment in resilience and for making plans and testing those plans. Now, we all know there are inevitably some policy failures when governments follow strategies that fail to deliver the desired results, often because the ends of the policy and the ways and means of delivering it are not aligned. And sometimes, of course, however logical the policy might appear to be to its drafters, the public does not buy into it. It's often the case that new policies have to be developed in haste in situations of great uncertainty. Leadership makes a big difference here. Which leadership can generate quickly a sense of purpose in circumstances when danger looms and guide the political class and the public to reframe expectations and goals accordingly. There are clearly going to be some serious questioning when the pandemic has ebbed and when genuine international comparisons can be made about whether the policies followed in the nations of the UK were optimal and taken early enough. But we know that, well, we know there can also be intelligence failures when the threatening signs are missed or misunderstood, perhaps due to unimaginative tasking, failures to access relevant data, or indeed cognitive failures in assessment. Such failures are inevitable to some extent in a dangerous and chaotic world. And there can also be failures in imagination, in not seeing long-term developments that might come to threaten us. Here, I observe that a coronavirus outbreak was not a strategic surprise, even although the timing and characteristics of the exact mutation that took place could not have been predicted. We should also recognize that there is a category of warning failure that falls into the cracks between intelligence and policy. Warning is a deliberative act. It's being proactive. Warning is more than writing an intelligence estimate or a scientific paper. An effective warning is a loud shout to senior leadership for attention, giving three things: a strong knowledge claim about a very worrying development, an assessment of why it really matters if it happens to us, and sufficient illustration of how current policies may fail in order to drive home the message that action is needed now to avoid disaster. For example, recognizing that if a dangerous virus did take hold in the UK, there would be a mismatch between the plans, the sensible plans that had been made, and the availability of means, PPE, testing facilities, critical care beds with ventilators, insufficient processes to cover the care sector, and so on. So it's important, I think, to see warnings as a powerful combination of professional intelligence and scientific assessment, giving strategic notice of developments with serious potential for harm, a combination of those with honest and rigorous policy analysis. And when this crisis is over, we need to look at what national security warning system would be best suited to cover natural hazards as well as malign threats. All governments need strategic notice of possible serious developments that can trigger a debate, an honest debate, of whether it is worth investing in precautionary measures to build up national resilience to cope, just in case the risk crystallizes. I'll pause there. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed. We'll take questions at the end, so I'll move swiftly on now to our next speaker, Suzanne Nichols, visiting fellow in war studies, former Foreign Office official who served as the head of the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre and also as Director of Counter-Terrorism. Suzanne, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm going to hopefully move on nicely from what Professor Omand has talked about to talk about a concrete example, which is how the terrorism warning system works. And I'm going to talk about risk, evidence, and blame within that system. When you're dealing with assessing risk in terrorism, you need to be clear what the risk is that you're trying to avoid. And that's quite straightforward, which is a terrorist attack which kills people. So the entire system is designed to prevent that risk from materializing. I'm going to start off by talking about evidence, where it relates to risk judgments. Just to be clear, evidence has multiple different meanings, and in its purest form, when we're talking about terrorism, evidence enables a successful prosecution of the terrorist before he or she has conducted a terrorist act. So for the police, evidence is collected meticulously, and whether or not they have collected enough evidence for a prosecution is an essential decider on whether or not an arrest can be made. And this means that the existence or not of prosecution level evidence is the critical decider in whether or not in the UK a terrorist plot can be disrupted. And in situations where the investigation is sufficiently under control, that's a decision that then the police and the security service have to make. Essentially, how long do they let the plot develop so that they can collect the evidence, so that they can then mount a successful prosecution at the end of it. That's the kind of police use of the word evidence. However, that's the kind of perfect case scenario where you've got the good intelligence about a plot and enough insight to be able to develop it so that you are confident that you can keep the public safe and secure a prosecution. In most cases, however, that isn't what happens. You either don't find out about it until very late in the day. You often have very, very fragmentary pieces of information about a plot, and sometimes you don't know about it at all. In cases where the threat emanates from overseas, it's unlikely that you're going to have anything like the same insight into an investigation or control over the situation, or any sense of what proportion of the evidence that you're seeing. I mean, it depends. Some places it's much clearer than others. But what that means is it makes the risk judgments much more difficult to take. So a critical part of the UK's counter-terrorism system is its warning system, which is the National Threat Level System, which is operated by the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre. And I'm going to talk about how a warning system works in practice and what are some of the pitfalls and challenges of it. In counter-terrorism, all threat level judgments, by definition, are not based on scientific evidence. If you had enough evidence or detail about a terrorist plot before it took place, then you would be able to disrupt it and the threat would therefore not materialize. On the other hand, if you waited for the complete evidence of a terrorist plot to materialize, then the bomb would already have gone off. And that can, of course, happen. And sometimes the threat level goes up actually after a bomb has gone off because you're still not quite sure whether the sort of threat is still extant. However, the point is that if you wait for scientific evidence before you take a decision, then you will always be behind the curve on what the risk is. And my point is that any decision on raising or lowering the threat level must be based not just on scientific evidence, but on the application of sound risk judgments. The National Threat Level System aims to make risk-based judgments about the level of threat before there is sufficient evidence by charting the likelihood of that attack happening. This enables action to be taken to provide mitigation in the form of protective measures, for example, by improving or increasing security checks. In most cases, there will just be fragments of information or evidence which indicate a potential threat, which means that the threat level might have to be raised. It's very seldom the case that there is so much information that the decision is clear and unambiguous. And in almost all cases, the point for decision will become before you have the critical data. It's worth just noting that perhaps the problem is simply one of terms. So the word scientific evidence or evidence implies a level of authority which it just doesn't have, and that's just so much the case in coronavirus as it is with terrorism. It would be better to substitute it with what we know at the moment, and that sort of removes that kind of sense that we have to wait for the complete picture, which we're never going to get before we take a decision. So if we accept that we're always going to have to wait, we're always going to take the decision before we have the complete picture, then I think we're already accepting that there is a step between the sort of the acquisition and corralling of our evidence and the policy decision. And that's the bit which is, in my view, that's where you essentially are applying human judgment. And I'm very grateful to Professor Omand for gifting me the insight that the Greeks already had a word for this, which is phronesis, which means the application of practical wisdom, enabling the individual to discern and make good judgments about what is the right thing to do in a situation. So the counterterrorism threat assessment system has now evolved over 20 years, and it's possible to draw out a few aspects to how that process works. Number one, start with what you know. So what that means is have as good a system of managing incoming information as it is possible for you to have. Know where your information is, and that includes fragments of information. Number two, start counting early and count everything. The data which enables you to look for patterns and to draw conclusions will only be there if you started collecting it before you knew that you needed it. And it's a frustration that frequently comes up, is that you kind of think, well, how many foreign fighters are there? And you think, well, actually, they've been going for the last 2 years. So if we weren't counting them for the last 2 years, then there's no way that we can know now. So get in there early and just start logging everything. Number three, prioritize wider understanding. Know as much as you can about the context, the history of the threat in all its many forms, so that you've got your level of basic knowledge is as high as it can be. Number four, watch the threat all the time. So as soon as it starts to change in any way, look at the patterns and map probable trajectories. Compare it to other examples that you've seen in the past and ask, what is likely to happen based both on general and specific knowledge from previous experience in other cases. Number five, have a really clear set of criteria for the analysts to apply to use as guides for making changes to the threat level system. So a uniform level of criteria so that you can then operate it across a large number of analysts and a large number of problems. And then the sixth, and I think the most important, is at that point, take the science out and apply reason and instinct. Even if something is 90% unlikely, that means that 10%, it's 10% likely, and that 10% might be now. So don't let the science at that point crowd out the judgment. And this final step is a crucial one. There is a point where statistics and probability are possibly misleading and genuinely unhelpful. The numbers, as you say, the example is that President Obama, when he was deciding whether or not to authorize the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, was given two competing percentages of likelihood that Osama bin Laden was going to be there. One was 70%, one was much lower. And that completely threw the president, because he was prepared to decide to go for it. And then on someone, maybe it's only 50% likely. And he thought, oh, I don't know what to do. In practice, Osama bin Laden was either there or he wasn't there. And these percentages, even, I think the difficulty is that the percentages are actually the assessment community communicating their level of uncertainty, and they're nothing more than that. So in practice, Osama bin Laden is 100% there or he's 0% there. And what you're telling is, I am 70% uncertain. And there's a point where that ceases to be useful when the person is trying to take a decision. Nothing is perfect. Any system where a critical decision rests on human judgments at the end of the day will not be. There's a real risk that there's a temptation to try and avoid warning failure by warning too much. And in the terrorism threat level system, the way you would do that would be to increase the threat level to ensure that you could say, oh, I warned them, I put the threat up. And the danger is, of course, that you can never be proved to be wrong, because you can say, I put the threat up, therefore, and it didn't happen. Not, I put the threat up and it didn't happen because it wasn't there. I think the people who operate it are mindful that if you cry wolf, then you undermine the credibility of the system, and you do so quite quickly. So everybody needs to know that when it goes up, it only goes up for a reason. Interestingly, I think that the hardest thing to do is actually not to put the threat level up, but to reduce the threat level, because when you put it up, you're transferring the risk to the response departments. When you're putting it down, you're taking the risk back into the assessment community. Of course, the key question then is who takes the risk-based decision? In terrorism, it was very clear early on that you needed to have a single authoritative voice that could then be acted on by the police or the Foreign Office, Department of Transport, and it needed to be independent of any influence, so it could build trust and expertise without the accusation it was being manipulated for political purposes. So the Home Secretary's role was to announce the decisions, not to influence them. And there is no automatic level, no automaticity between the threat level and the actions that are then taken in response to it. Those decisions rest with the police and other bodies who are responsible for protective security and mitigation. Independence works for both parties because it enables the Prime Minister to be seen to be acting as a part of a scientific process, and protects them from accusations that they're using it for political ends. But it also, and this is a critical point with reference to today's, protects them from the aftermath if the threat level decision turns out to be wrong. And David Cameron said as much when he evacuated Sharm el-Sheikh, and he said, I act on the advice of my experts. And we've seen the current Prime Minister doing the same. And just very, very quickly on blame, I wanted to, the psychology of blame is less about whose fault something is. So a terrorist attack is the fault of the terrorists. But blame is also about whether or not you did what you were supposed to have done. If the warning system failed to provide the right warning, then it can be reasonably expected to explain why. Just as the protective security measures, if they were not put in place, it might be reasonably asked why. And that means, going back to the steps that I mentioned earlier, that the most important aspect is to have a really clear process for managing the information, explaining how the decisions are taken, so that if an attack happened, it's possible to demonstrate why it was the right course of action was taken at the time on the basis of all available information. And it won't be possible always to get it right, but it is important to be able to demonstrate that everything possible was done. Thank you.
Suzanne, thank you very much indeed. And without any further ado, we shall move on to our next speaker, Keith Bevan, also a visiting research fellow with us. And Keith is a former Foreign Office official with over 30 years of experience, including a stint as the Director of Counter-Terrorism. Keith, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. I want to give some brief thoughts on warning, risk and resilience in the next 10 minutes, if I possibly can, drawing on the experience of work against a terrorist threat over the last 20 years or so. And I think I need to start with some brief introductory thoughts about why experience in counterterrorism might have wider relevance. I should be clear, I'm not claiming that every aspect of CT work will be relevant for all future threats. But I do think there are some important characteristics of the CT challenge that can also be applied to future threats. And as a test of this, as I go through this talk, you can ask yourself how much of what I'm saying about CT could also be applied to the very different problem of COVID. So 3 of those important characteristics of CT I want to highlight. Firstly, rapid change. The terrorist threat isn't necessarily tied to a state. In fact, over the last 20 years or so, state-sponsored terrorism has been a relatively minor issue. It comes from individuals and society rather than states. And the significance of this is that society can change rapidly, and this can lead to equally rapid developments in the nature of the threat. Perhaps a classic example of this in the last few years was the very rapid adoption by the Islamic State of the possibilities in social media. Second thing, in addition to pace, I think there's also an issue about scale or magnitude. The impact of what we can do, both as societies and individuals, have been massively empowered by technology and modern communications. And how a threat plays out will depend very much on how it interacts with these factors. As an illustration of what I mean, I think 9/11 was a classic example of a threat that leveraged the modern world so that a small group of people could have disproportionate impact. That's the second point. Third, and connected to this, I think you have to think not just about the direct impact of a threat, but also about the secondary impact. So the way society reacts to a threat can amplify or mitigate the damage. Human factors are often key to understanding this. And there's a classic Private Eye cover that you may have seen a few years ago about counterterrorism that I think made this point brilliantly about the importance of the human factors. And you could probably, I think it probably passes this as a COVID test. So that's just by way of context and to try to establish that CT, I think, does have wider relevance. To move on now then to try and say a few things about warning. And I've got 3 observations really. Firstly, that providing accurate warnings in a fast changing and incredibly complex world is inherently difficult, and we should calibrate our expectations accordingly. On the one hand, you've got the danger of missing important events. So again, 9/11, of course, or the collapse of the Iraqi state in the face of Daesh forces in Mosul in 2014. Almost by definition, the most shocking events are going to be those which you hadn't foreseen. And there's, of course, a connection here to what I've just been saying about the characteristics of threat in the modern world. On the other hand, there's a risk summarized in the economic quip about the stock market predicting all 9 of the last 5 recessions. Security professionals are employed to look for dangers, and it's easy to focus on one side of the equation and lose sight of or underestimate the factors which constrain or mitigate the danger. So we should understand that warning systems will not always spot things in the modern world. The further into the future you try and peer, the more you are at risk of your imagined world being knocked flying by some factor you missed in our complex reality. And that's why the other 2 issues in this seminar, risk management and resilience, are so important. That said, though, my second point on warning is that good systems can make a difference. And in their absence, in their absence, accurate warnings are more likely to be missed. The attacks last year in Sri Lanka look to be a classic example of this, and the role of organizations like JTAC and the JIC are important in helping get best value out of available information and feed it rapidly to government. And my last observation on warning is that a warning can have 2 levels of significance. It will always have significance to the people you're trying to protect through giving them a warning, because it gives them a chance to do something about the threat. The impact of that will depend on a host of factors that determine how seriously the warning is taken and what action results. And as I've just said, good systems are important for this. But warnings, if they're public, can also have an impact on the threat itself. I mean, that's obviously only the case if you're talking about human action, because a virus or an environmental threat won't in itself change, no matter how accurate a warning is given about its threat. That's the difference between that kind of threat and a threat from a human actor, because a public warning can change the nature of the threat itself. For the potential attacker, they've lost the element of surprise, and that's going to change their equation. It may stop the immediate threat and persuade the perpetrator to divert into something different. It may well make them more cautious. Whether this leads in the longer term to a reduced or a more dangerous threat is a complicated issue. But this effect on the potential attacker, rather than the people you're trying to protect, is sometimes the most important aspect of a warning. So moving on to risk management, I'm just going to touch briefly on this. Two key factors in CT risk management systems, I think, have wider applicability. Firstly, the need to deal with overload. There's always more work than you can do. So you need a methodology that helps you prioritize quickly and, as far as possible, consistently. Where you have a lot of work that needs doing, you can't expect all the decisions to be made by the senior leadership. The system would simply grind to a halt. You need to be able to share it out and bring as many minds as possible to bear on the problem. So you need systems and a culture that enables this. Under the pressure of dealing with many years of terrorist attacks, MI5 evolved some very effective systems and approaches to doing this that have been well described in reports of the ISC, the oversight body, which you can find. Secondly, you're dealing, as I pointed out before, with a rapidly changing picture at times. So your risk management, you need systems and staff and a culture with the flexibility to be able to cope with this. You want them to be working on the problems that count today, rather than those that were preoccupying them last year or last month. And following from this, a wider thought prompted by the response to COVID. For threats that affect society as a whole, there's a question about where and how the risk is managed. Is it through central high-level bodies that make decisions which everyone else then follows? Or is it through empowering more devolved decision-making about managing risk to a more local or even individual level? There are, of course, two advantages to devolving risk management as widely as possible. It increases the brainpower available to dealing with the problem, and it allows much more fine-grained decisions, which can better reflect particular or local realities. Three things, though, you do need to consider as you're trying to decide how far you can spread the load. Firstly, availability of information. There may be constraints such as the need to protect intelligence sources or privacy concerns around personal information. And as anyone who's worked on information systems knows, the deceptively simple ambition to get the right information to the right people conceals a world of pain to make it happen in practice. And then, even if you can get the information out, there's then the question of the ability to make sense of it. Some decisions require specialist knowledge or expertise. So working out the ability of a building to withstand a blast isn't something that anyone can do. Making statistical deductions from large amounts of data requires particular training. And finally, there's a question of needing a common approach to managing the risk. As we've seen in the current crisis, different people can have very different perceptions of what is an acceptable risk. And there are also big differences in individual appetites for even making a risk judgment at all. Some people, I think we can all think of recent examples, are very happy to make risk judgments themselves. Others just want someone they trust to do it for them and tell them what to do. Finally, just moving on to resilience. And a couple of thoughts here. So going back to what I was saying on warning, my assumption is that there will continue to be future threats that get past our defenses and surprise us. So resilience is important. And on this, I've looked back at a lecture I've given to MA courses at King's over the last year. in which I set out what I think are some of the key characteristics of a successful counterterrorism effort. And I suggest that these largely pass the COVID test for broader relevance. So very briefly, they're the things I hope you can see on the screen. Strategy, by which I mean both the game plan about what you're going to do and the systems to mobilize effort to pursue it. Partnerships, both domestically and international. Analysis, the ability to find and make sense of the information that can help you crack a problem. Prioritization and risk management I've already touched on. Consent, which I think is the key to mobilizing effort in a democracy. If you don't have it, you're going to have problems. And finally, and you can see how this connects to pretty much everything I've been saying, the ability to learn lessons quickly is key to coping with the threat in a fast-changing world. And my point about all this is that you need the systems and perhaps most importantly, the culture embedded in your government and society to allow you to think about and address these issues in dealing with a threat if you're going to have true resilience. And the quicker and the better you are at getting on top of these questions, the more likely you are to succeed. Get any of them wrong, and you're going to have problems. Thanks. I think I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Keith. And then last but not least, and I think we're certainly saving the best till last, is John Taylor. John has worked in the intelligence and security sector for nearly 50 years, most recently as a trainer and advisor, and is also a visiting fellow in the Department of War Studies. So John, over to you.
I think I should say thank you, Mike. I would like to say thank you, and it is indeed an honor to be invited to speak and contribute to this conference. It's also very humbling to follow three speakers who've been at the center of decision-making, at the top of decision-making, and who have contributed substantially to our safety over the last 30 years, if not more. But I am going to talk about the information that is available to the analysts. I recognize far too late in life that it's actually the analysts who are the really important people. Fiction often depicts the agent runner, the spy, the sort of James Bonds, the Jason Bournes as the hero. I have to admit that I've come across a good many of these people in real life, and they do like to think of themselves as being the center of attention, the center of all things. But it's humbling to remember that when the Prime Minister needs to go and talk to anybody, he doesn't talk to the case officer. The Prime Minister wants to talk to the analysts, the people such as the three people you've just been listening to. But the question I'm going to address today is much more about the information that the analysts and the decision makers need, and where do they get that information from? And I'm going to talk a lot more about human sources, but I do want to put it into the context, which is important, of other methods, other types of source. The most important source, I say most important, but the biggest, it's the open source. It's something that we all have access to. We all like to think we know how to manipulate Google and the various other things that there are available to us. The problem, as speakers so far have alluded to, Suzanne and Keith particularly, is the vast quantity of information out there. And how do you validate it? But as we shall discover, it is there, and we would be foolish to ignore it. There are technical sources. The NSA and our own GCHQ, which of course David knows well, devote enormous resources to getting technical information, whether it's ELINT or SIGINT, or indeed just data about telephone usage and the rest. And of course, law enforcement agencies can, but with government permission, with permission and clearance from the government or from established authorities, are able to monitor conversations and other things. An area not often thought about is, of course, our own allies and friendly governments. And particularly since 9/11, there's been a vast increase in the amount of information that has been exchanged between governments. It's cheap, it's not very risky. Of course, you have to give some to get some. But there is a significant health warning, certainly in my experience, and that is that our enemies, but also our friends, are quite capable of issuing intelligence in the form of a report that they pass freely to you, but it has a political twist, a bias, because they're using this to try and influence us ourselves. Useful, very useful, important, desperately important, but it does need to be looked at quite carefully. So what of human sources? I'm going to call them agents, and we'll use that because that's the British word. Some parts in America, for example, in the FBI, an agent is actually a member of the service. But so I'm talking about agents or human sources who are delivering what I call intelligence, that is secret information. And for the purpose of today, I'm going to look at two particular varieties, if you like. And the first is those who offer information, not dissimilar to whistleblowers. The second group are those who have been targeted by a law enforcement agency, and they have been cultivated and recruited to provide secret intelligence. So of the first group, offers of intelligence, I've got three examples. First is a Russian called Vasily Mitrokhin. Many of you, I'm sure, will have read the Mitrokhin archives, which were edited both by Mitrokhin himself and Christopher Andrew at Cambridge University. Mitrokhin spent decades working as a senior archivist in the KGB and systematically collected copies of papers. He took them home to his dacha and he hid them, I think, under the floor of his dacha there. And then in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he went to Latvia and walked into the British embassy and said, "We had these documents, would you like them?" There was a bit of a sort of moment of, is this possible? But anyway, the British did. And later that year, he and his family and all the documents, which were contained in a number of very large trunks, were brought successfully and secretly to the UK. Counter-espionage experts were overwhelmed. The intelligence haul was enormous and historians loved it. Now, it would be easy to dismiss this as only of historical value, but that would be to diminish the contribution because we learned an enormous amount about the KGB and its successors, and to this day, they remain a major threat to this world, and we understand a lot about them and the individuals and the people because of the information Mitrokhin gave us. Suzanne and Keith both talked a lot about counterintelligence, a little bit about Iraq, but I want to give you a second example, a much more worrying one, of a man who goes by the code word of curveball, Rafid Alwan. He defected from Iraq in 1999. He claimed that he worked as a chemical engineer to a plant that manufactured mobile biological weapon laboratories as part of an Iraqi effort of weapons of mass destruction. The American and British governments used this information to build a rationale for military action in the lead up to 2003. Of course, it wasn't the only thing, but it was significant. In February 2011, he was interviewed by the Guardian, and he admitted in that for the first time that he lied about his story. And there was a further damning report by Panorama in 2013. It's available online if anybody cares to look at it, showing a very smug, in my view, very uncomfortable interview with Curveball when he admitted he had done it. He didn't seem to mind too much about the thousands of lives that had been lost as a result of, partly as a result of his intelligence, but he said he wanted to bring down Saddam Hussein. So there are also many dangers in relying too much on a single and, in this case, unassessed human source. My third example is Li Wenliang. Now, if this was a normal lecture, I'd at this point pause and say, does anybody know who Li is? He was actually a Chinese ophthalmologist, and he worked in Wuhan. And on the 30th of December last year, he received an internal report about a SARS patient with unusual symptoms. He shared the report, which then circulated widely. Rumors of a deadly SARS outbreak spread quickly on Chinese social media platforms, and Wuhan police summoned and admonished him, that's Li, for making false comments on the internet about unconfirmed SARS outbreak. As you all probably know, he died of the disease on the 7th of February this year, aged 33. The subsequent Chinese official inquiry exonerated him, and the Communist Party of China formally offered a solemn apology to his family and revoked the admonition. Now, of course, there was no exploitation by intelligence agencies of Li or of anybody at that time, certainly not to my knowledge. I'd be very surprised if there was. But if that information had been properly harnessed, the world might have looked very different today. But that's a hard call to put on the analyst. How do you, with a massive amount of information that is available and that is flooding into those offices, wherever it is, to pick out that one report and say, this one might be more significant. But of course, if it is handled by professional service, an intelligence, a security service, police service, then the person can be properly interviewed, can be properly investigated, and we might be able to do something about it. So what of the second group of human sources? Those who are targeted by intelligence officers, cultivated and recruited. Information about these operations and even more about the intelligence is of course hard to come by, but it's not impossible. There are some reliable and open sources. I'm going to give 2 or 3 examples. Cold War days again, we know much about Oleg Gordievsky, well documented in Ben McIntyre's recent book, The Spy and the Traitor. That talks a lot about how he was targeted, cultivated and recruited and substantially run. Morton Storm worked for the British, Danish and US services and wrote his story in his autobiography, A Spy Inside Al-Qaeda. And a third person, Eamon Dean, who also worked with the British, but against Al-Qaeda and went back to Afghanistan under British direction, in his book, 9 Lives, also about his time and the information he passed to the British and others about Al-Qaeda and terrorist events. The difference about all these 3 agents, these last 3 agents, and those discussed earlier, is that they were able to provide intelligence about potentially hostile activity. If their information was partial, they could be briefed to go back and find out more. In 1982, when Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were proclaiming the Soviet Union as the empire of evil, the JIC had no choice but to assess the threat from Russia as very high. And there it would be in the top right-hand corner of the risk assessment. I'm not sure they had risk assessment documents in such sophistication in those days, but that's certainly where it was. But Gordievsky actually showed us how weak and unprepared the Soviet Union were in those days. And when Gorbachev visited the United Kingdom in 1984, Mrs. Thatcher was able to say of Mr. Gorbachev, then emerging as the next leader of the Soviet Union, I like Mr. Gorbachev. He is a man I can do business with. It's not surprising. She had read every single one of his briefs, and she knew exactly what the Soviet Union's intentions were. He, I think, significantly did change the West's risk assessment and was able, therefore, to assess those risks in a much better way. And as Suzanne said earlier, the difficult thing that we all have to do is to reduce the threat level. Putting it up, relatively easy, because you worst case it. What we're talking about is to bring it down. Morton Storm and Impending were able to provide enormous amounts of information about Al-Qaeda and its leaders and informed governments about the risk and risks AQ posed. Both provided intelligence about specific activities, including, for example, warnings of specific attacks. Chemical weapons were planned to be used in New York on the New York subway. Again, I think it was Impending who provided intelligence that would enable the New York authorities or the US authorities to stop such a thing. But there are, of course, many problems about dealing with human beings. They lie. And if they don't lie, then they allow their own prejudices, their vanity and various other things to come in. Curveball was, of course, a classic example, but many are blessed with vanity and prejudice, and it needs a skillful case officer to neutralize. Officers of intelligence and whistleblowers come randomly, and once out, that is no longer a party to what's going on in their countries, they can no longer inform on what's going on in current events. Agents take a long time to meet, cultivate, recruit, and then to validate, to be sure that the information that comes, as mostly with Gordievsky, that was an operation that lasted 8-9 years. In the UK, we are blessed, as David and others have described, to have sophisticated systems to assess these are JIC, NSC, JTAC, and of course we now have the sophisticated National Risk Register. And I pause just for a moment as I don't know if it's true, but the 2019 register was leaked to The Guardian not so long ago and spoke in frighteningly prescient words about the awful impact of a corona-type flu. The problem is then what to do about the assessment. Senior officials and politicians have to take difficult decisions. And in the UK, intelligence services do not decide what to target. They are tasked. Elsewhere in the world, agencies decide themselves what to do, but that makes a significant difference because it means the politicians, the senior people in the executive have to actually say, you know what, pandemic, potential problem, where's it going to come from? Wet markets in China. Somebody has to say those sort of things and then say to the intelligence services, whether that's GCHQ or MI6 or whoever, go and get intelligence. Good intelligence from human beings takes time and is fraught with risk. The walk-in, very valuable, but it's a bit random. And in any event, human intelligence always has to be combined with other forms of intelligence, whether that's from technical, from liaison, or other forms. So just very briefly, agents, I think, can help the analyst. They can assess the risk, as Gordievsky did, as Michokin did, Morton Storm and Impending did. They can give enormous amounts of information for the analyst so they can assess the risks. They can warn of specific threats, like the chemical attack on the New York subway. Gordievsky himself gave a specific warning about a potential spy from within the British services, a man called Michael Bettany. And it was Gordievsky who gave the name of Michael Bettany, or didn't give the name, but said there was a man from the security service who was offering his services. And it was Gordievsky who provided that warning. And of course, they contribute to resilience by identifying the threats we face and so help others prepare for the attack. I leave the question unanswered about how any elements in the intelligence world could have contributed to stemming the spread of COVID-19. But I come back always, and I learned the hard way. It is the analyst who actually has got to bear the responsibility. And the three previous speakers are the people, the sort of people who actually took those decisions. And my admiration to them all is enormous. Thank you very much, Mike.
John, thank you very much. Thank you to all four of our speakers for not only fascinating talks, but being very punctual with the length of their talks. So we have half an hour left for questions. There have been questions flying in as you've all been speaking. I would remind all four speakers that you're now live and your videos are on, and you know, we can hear and see you. So do remember that. So let me begin with a question which came from someone called Florent Comte, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. And I think it was a question for David in the first instance. And Florent asks, if we refer to the paradigm of resilience versus protection in terms of national security, is there a more active role to give to the public in contributing to the knowledge that the intelligence community needs?
Yes, I think is the answer.
Great.
And Suzanne can talk about information volunteered from the public in the context of counterterrorism. But this is true when you think about, say, the pandemic. You think about the local response, because in the end, all crises are local in their impact. Then you have to think about what is the situation in a given locality amongst all the different players, both local government, private sector, companies, and so on, in order to organize to deal with the crisis and actually provide that resilience. In the end, somebody has to cut the sandwiches, somebody has to deliver the medicines to those who are in quarantine. So I think yes is the answer. The more the public can be engaged, the more robust I think the system is going to be.
If any of our other speakers want to contribute anything, do say, by the way. If not, I shall move on to the next question.
I might just, just very briefly, I think this does connect to one of the things I was talking about, which is in terms of public role on counterterrorism. There's one thing about, can the public help you identify people who are terrorists in the first place? And obviously, there's a big role for them in that. But there's secondly, a role for the public in managing the risks that result from terrorism. So, for example, people have to make individual decisions about where are they prepared to go on holiday. Are people prepared to go to Paris? You know, were people prepared to go to Paris in the wake of the attacks there or not? So in that sense, I think everybody has a role to play, not just in potentially helping spot problems, but also in terms of working out how to respond and manage the risks in your everyday lives.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Next, I'm taking these questions somewhat out of order and trying to collate some of them and various other things. So next we have a question for Suzanne. This is from Mike Green from Cadence Consultancy, all the way out in Cornwall, where I'm sure it's lovely at this time of year. Suzanne, in your 6 steps, you do not include identifying the known unknowns. Is this not critical to prioritizing resources and maybe to elevating issues to a higher level to open up other sources, avenues to fill intelligence gaps?
Yes, I think I was working from the basis that everything we were doing was at the very least about known unknowns and often about the unknown unknowns. So if I didn't mention it, I think it's because that's the entire process in a way. You start off by working out what you do know, and that inevitably leads you to then say, this is what we know about this risk of threat. There's a whole lot of other stuff that we don't know. That then becomes the investigation. So the steps that I was talking about, they're all about collecting and analysing information which deals with stuff that you know about and stuff that you don't know about. And of course, the hardest thing are always the unknown unknowns. So you might have a whole load of information on one thing, and actually the problem is somewhere else entirely where you have no coverage of it at all. And the reason that's most difficult is that you then have to make, and this is really hard with threat management, you then have to make a decision about what the total absence of information means for the threat. So if we have, I'm just picking, this is a random example, but if we have absolutely no information that there is a threat to tourists in the Philippines, totally fictional, but if we have no information, does that mean that there is no threat to tourists in the Philippines? Or does it mean that we have no means of collecting information which would enable us to determine the extent of the threat to tourists in the Philippines. And that's the bit that's the hardest for the analysts to do, because that's a total absence of any kind of information. And it may mean there's no threat, but it may mean that there's a big threat that we haven't spotted.
Thank you. Do our other speakers want to come in on this at all?
Yeah, I just offer a thought. There was almost an example of that during the early days of working up on COVID-19, where it was certainly the case back, say, at the end of February, that the risk in the UK was low because there were very, very few identified cases. But that's where my estimation process, where you make assumptions, if there were to be a significant outbreak, then how serious would that be? And that would then lead decision makers into not saying, well, the risk is low, but actually saying the risk is potentially very high. And therefore we should focus on doing those things which reduce the likelihood that we're going to be in that position.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Next question is one for Keith from Paul, who works for UK Defence Intelligence. Keith, we put an extreme amount of pressure on our intelligence analysts in regards to the terrorist watch list and how they prioritise those threats through giving them timely and accurate information and providing that information to the agencies. How can we better assist the analysts to filter the lower priority information and bring the imminent threat intelligence to the fore to prevent attacks?
Okay. It's not straightforward. All you can do is try to have the best information that you provide people in terms of what is known about things that can help you differentiate between people who are higher risk and people who are lower risk. And that's not going to be perfect. This is where, I mean, what Suzanne, I think, was saying about there is inevitably going to be a role for human judgment and instinct having to come in. But in the end, it is a question about prioritization. You've got a limited amount of time. You've got to try and work out with that limited amount of time, what is the most valuable way you can spend it. So it's a question about providing people with the best frame of reference possible for making those decisions. And in the end, you have to fall back on human instinct when everything else fails.
But it does help to have some process and methodology, because you will get it wrong sometimes. And I think, you know, the public has to understand this is not perfect science. You are going to find occasions in which the prioritization was wrong, but you're in a much stronger position if you've worked out a methodology for doing it and you stick to that. And then people can see where the decisions actually came from, and you've got an audit trail after the event to go back to, rather than just the gut instinct of the experienced analyst.
Indeed, and as I mentioned, the security service and police over many years have developed some very good systems around this that certainly work in the UK context.
Good. We now two questions I'll take together because they're broadly similar, both for John. First question comes from Ewan Grant, who's a former intelligence analyst at HM Customs and Excise, and Ewan asks, is intelligence analysis widely defined getting the balance between human and technical sources correct? Has this got better or worse since the internet? And related to that, a question from Susan Swift, who has asked, how do you see the collection of, or the reliance on humans changing and with the proliferation of technology and the sort of COVID responses moving away from face-to-face relationships?
Oh, yeah. Excellent. Well, Ewan, balance between human and technical. I think the two live side by side. They cannot be separate. The number of times you are looking for a potential agent, or one turns up, the first thing is to turn to technology in one form or another. You'll turn to GCHQ and say, have you ever heard of this person, or do you know anything about this? Because very often that will validate the information you're getting. So, and I'm quite clear that the two and the other elements work very closely together. And as a balance, yes, that balance has got to be there. There are other things in years gone by where we've got the balance wrong. We've depended too much on one thing or the other, or we've not talked to people enough. I mean, that's perhaps the biggest derogation, that we didn't talk to the Americans, or Americans weren't talking to themselves, or whatever. And I think that that balance is particularly important. And when you see the sort of work, and Suzanne was being, well, I'd say modest, but wasn't tech, but the sort of work that was going on in JTAC, absolutely essential. The response to 9/11, making sure all of these elements come together. So I'm pretty confident that we recognize the importance of the balance. We still think that all sources are important, and we're getting it about right. Suzanne, I'm sure, will come up with some places where perhaps we got it wrong. I don't know of them. And but JTAC is certainly essential in terms of terrorism. And maybe that's an example that we can take as we look more widely. Suzanne, the questioner, looking forward to whether about the problems of human sources and days of technology, and particularly now when we're all Zooming and Teaming and all the other elements, and we can't actually talk to each other face to face in some discreet, nice restaurant, which is typically where we like to go. Yes, it's different, but I think we're pretty, as I read it, and I'm no longer part of it, of course, but that people are being pretty inventive about how you can go about it. Humans is always going to give you that little bit of extra intelligence, extra information, which technology can't. You're relying very heavily on analysts with technology surveillance and all of these things. Humans is going to, good human will take you directly to the point, but it's very expensive. So Suzanne, yes, I'm sure there is going to be a place for humans in the future. It's different. Sometimes it's easier. Some people quite like this, this Zoom existence. It's harder for some of the case officers, I recognize, but it's not impossible by any means.
Can't help observing that John mentioned the case of Vasily Mitrokhin, working ignored in the basement of KGB headquarters in the archives. Yeah. You might like to ponder who the modern equivalent would be, the geek ignored in the basement with root access to the servers.
It's the sort of man that you look to, sort of people like Mr. Snowden, who did something not dissimilar, but you're quite right. And technology these days makes it so much easier to collect that information. You don't have to go and hide it away in the bottom of your heel of your shoe or whatever and put it into your dacha. But you've got to know a bit about technology, and technology, as I see your eyebrow twitching a bit there, David, suggesting that anything technological is actually vulnerable.
Okay, I've got 4 COVID-related questions that they're not addressed to anyone in particular, but I'll read them all out, and then whoever would care to offer a response, please do. First of these 4 questions comes from Martin Bricknell, professor in conflict health and military medicine with us at King's, former Lieutenant General and head of the Army's medical service. He asks, how do you think the creation of the Joint Biosecurity Centre will improve government decisions regarding COVID response and future threats? Related to that, we have 2 sort of similar questions from Lee Motola, New Jersey, USA, hopefully coming to King's in September to be an MA student with us. And also Tony Manganello, another American who's a PhD student, has said, in the US, there have been plenty of analysis given to how our leadership discounted or ignored vast amounts of warnings and risk assessments. There have been comparisons between the style of the US response and the UK response, both characterized by the underestimation of the seriousness of the pandemic. As experts in risk management, warning and assessments, do you feel that this accurate and expert advice was ignored because it was not politically advantageous? And then two other related questions. One from Jack Taylor, who is in Budapest, Hungary, working at the NATO Centre of Excellence for Military Medicine. As a medical doctor, he doesn't get to hear about these things very often. So his question is, how loud do we have to shout to get the attention of decision makers to take notice of things that are less sexy than terrorism, for example, pandemics? And finally, a question from Derek Williams, who is an MA offer holder from sunny Surrey in the UK. How big a factor do you feel was the early misinformation about COVID from China in resulting in what was suboptimal assessments on how to manage it in the UK? So four sort of, or five related questions about COVID, and over to all of you. Who'd like to go first?
Yeah, shall I kick off with some
David, thank you.
quick point on the Joint Biosecurity Centre? I mean, it clearly has potential. I don't know enough about it to be able to give a proper analysis, but on the analogy with JTAC, and there's a lot of controversy when Eliza Manning and Buller and I set up JTAC after 9/11. Did you really need such a body? Wouldn't it be better to let different agencies work independently and so on? And what it's shown over the years is that it's built a reputation for being authoritative, impartial, for applying reason, as Suzanne has explained. And that's given it that direct drive into the senior decision makers and indeed the National Security Council when necessary. And I would hope that the Joint Biosecurity Centre would achieve something of the same purpose. On whether we were all too slow or indeed diverted by political matters, all I'd say is there's a very good article by Professor Laurie Friedman that's just been published in Survival, the Journal of the Institute of Strategic Studies, and I do recommend it. It's Friedman, F-R-E-E, M-A-N, and he's done a very detailed analysis of what we know so far about the UK experience. And it does raise some significant questions about whether, although there was modeling available and analysis available, the shout may not have been quite loud enough about what could happen on some of the moderate worst case assumptions to get through early enough. And Laurie points out there were other diversions. We had a budget, for example, a national budget, right in the middle of this decision-making cycle. On the point about priorities, I think I would point to cybersecurity and to the rise of state tensions over subversive activities, interference with the 2016 US presidential election and so on, to show that actually it's not all about terrorism and that the national security establishments are now really rather focused on other things as well as terrorism. And that's the problem. You don't get rid of priorities. You, I'm afraid, have to add other things as the world develops. I'll stop at that point.
Thank you.
Mike, could I come in and build on what David said about Joint Biosecurity Centre? I think it's very early days, and this is, if you wanted to set something up, this is the worst time to do it because you're doing it in the middle of the crisis with all the attention focused on you. I think all these questions link up because how loud do you have to shout? Well, you would have had to shout less loud if there had been one central coordinated place where all the information about biosecurity threats would have been corralled rather than in the multiple different departments which we had until. So with hindsight, we needed a Joint Biosecurity Centre a long time ago, and it's a terrific thing that it exists now. It is a difficult moment for it to be born. And one of the things that I tried to bring out about independence of JTAC and the relationship between independence and public confidence and trust in the judgments, you need to be able to take difficult decisions and decisions that are contrary sometimes to what the politicians would like. So you have to be able to go to them and say, I know it's inconvenient, but you need to evacuate British holidaymakers from Egypt. So the Joint Biosecurity Centre needs to be able to say that kind of thing to government and to carry the full weight. I think the thing that makes its job harder than JTAC's is about secrecy. So when JTAC operates the national threat level system, it is able to be a single authoritative voice because it, in theory, is the repository of all available information, and only a fragment of that will be available to the public. So you're working on the basis that JTAC knows more than the public about what the threat might be. So when it takes a decision, people can question it, but at a certain point that questioning breaks down because they don't have as much information. For the Joint Biosecurity Centre, it's going to be competing against a whole load of already existing scientific and expert bodies, which are going to say, well, we've done our own modelling and we don't agree. So that thing about establishing yourself as the authoritative voice is going to be a lot harder for them. And then I think David was right on Laurie Friedman's article, which sort of gives the whole timeline of the coronavirus decisions globally, which was fantastic. The point of, I think, one of the sort of critical points that I was trying to get across is how to be confident to take decisions without evidence. And for me, the timeline that was most sort of shocking from a terrorism analysis point of view was the gap between the 30th of January, when the WHO declared a public health emergency, and the 11th of March, when the WHO declared it was a pandemic. So they waited until it was a pandemic before they said it was a pandemic. And I think what I would have done in terrorism is I would have said, this is clearly a public health emergency. What are the factors? What are the things that are going to make this worse? And are we seeing those? And then you would have thought that you would be able, you find some mechanism of saying, this is not yet a pandemic, but on every available indicator, the prediction is that by the 11th of March, it will be a pandemic. So countries should operate now on the basis that we're going to have a pandemic. And that was, I think, the bit of communication that was missing.
I just chip in a little bit and following up on what Suzanne just said and David before. I of course, welcome the establishment of a joint biomedical centre. And I'm sure that Tom, and we all know, many of us know Tom, is an excellent choice to take that forward. And what it will bring, I hope, is what happened in JTAC as in terms of the analysis. And it goes to what how David broke down the analytical process, because you see things and I wonder whether the analytical process in the medical world is still at stages 1 and 2 of David's chart. And what I hope that will happen with the JBC is that it will move it along that so that the analytical processes enable them, and I don't know what happens in the WHO. I spent a few years in Geneva, but I don't know if they've got that yet. But that our systems should be able to take the who and the what and move on through the why, and then to some of the more strategic things. And with the authority, which is so important, Suzanne, and which you had, I know, but others had, of going to the government and say, hey, you know what? Egypt's a bad place, get everybody out. And it will come, but of course, you said, it has to start now. But I think that the sophistication of the analytical processes that you had forgotten that Eliza and you, David, had set it up, but I should have remembered, I apologize. But the processes of that will then be applied, and that will give us a better chance. And just finally on Derek's point about China, and it's a bit of a hot potato, but I'll try and address it. Of course, it's a problem. China is a closed society. So is Iran. So is Russia, all of whom have major outlets. And that is a role which intelligence can be targeted upon, and to provide, instead of this megaphone diplomacy, which I fear we're in at the moment, but applying much more sensitive and thing. We need China. We can't ignore China. China is part of this whole thing. So we've got to influence them, and it's not by megaphone diplomacy. So I'm rather hoping that the intelligence services will be able to get information.
Can I just hazard one other thought about Suzanne's point about openness as against secrecy?
Yeah.
One of the most sensitive decisions governments have to take is on the setting of interest rates, in our case by the Bank of England. But actually, these days, it's done by a monetary policy committee whose minutes are published. And so we get to know on the committee who had which view about whether they should go up or down or remain the same. And whilst many of the old guard said, well, this will be the end of the world, and the pressure on those individuals will be enormous and so on and so on, actually that transparency has helped. And it's actually encouraged a kind of peer review of debate amongst economists, which I'm sure actually in the end leads to better decisions.
Yeah, and perhaps partly connected to that, a brief point I wanted to make, which is I've been stressing a lot the importance of having the resilience in your society that allows you to learn lessons quickly to help you best respond to a problem. And I think that's clearly going to be important here as well. I think part of that process, though, of learning lessons effectively is learning to filter out what, there's part of hindsight which is genuinely helpful, but it's also important to aim off for the fact that things which are obvious now perhaps wouldn't have been obvious before, and you need to sort of calibrate it accordingly. Because I think if you look back at the lessons from counterterrorism over the last 20 years, I think we can all probably think of times when in the immediate aftermath of something that has been a very big shock to our societies, we may have overreacted in some respects. And I think it will probably be as important in relation to COVID to make sure that we try and calibrate our learning lessons so that we don't overreact as it was, in the case of counterterrorism.
Yeah. Great, thank you. We're beginning to run out of time. We've only got a few minutes left, and we've had lots of questions about the relationship between policy making and intelligence, which we won't address, I think. I'd like to perhaps finish, I think, given the time, with a question that comes from Andy Blackwell in the UK. And it was a question addressed to Suzanne, but I think others will have views. And it was focused on terrorism, but I think we could extend it to the sort of COVID response, certainly in the UK and elsewhere. And the question is this: how is the risk of public threat fatigue addressed when assessment decisions of threat levels are made by JTAC?
I would like to think that decisions made by JTAC are agnostic of what the public will think about them. Decisions are taken according to a clear set of criteria, and that criteria has to be applied uniformly. So if the criteria are met, which mean that there is an increase in the threat and you need to change the threat level in order to warn, then you do so. And if it's inconvenient for the public, well, tough. It would be nice if the threat weren't there. That again can only happen if you've established a degree of credibility and trust, and you're not abusing the system by putting it up and putting it down in order essentially to protect yourself. So there is something just about whoever is running JTAC is always very mindful that they're custodian of a reputation and of a process which you don't want to undermine by abusing. But it is not that it would be wrong. It would be completely wrong if the threat level system was influenced by how the public might react to it.
Does anyone else have anything to add or any closing remarks? David?
Just in a closing remark, can I reassure the intelligence analysts or retired intelligence analysts who are listening that I am not advocating muddling up intelligence assessment and policy making. These are distinct, they're in separate but adjoining rooms as classically described. But a warning has to have a bit of both. Because if it doesn't have that policy assessment of why something has to be done and current policies won't work, it won't be taken seriously. And of course, if it isn't based on solid intelligence assessment of one kind or another, then of course it's liable to be dismissed for other reasons. But ideally, you need to find a mechanism in government that brings those two together.
Fantastic. Well, a good message to end on, I think, David. We, of course, won't be able to hear the 180 participants that are still here clapping, but please do join me in a round of applause for our 4 speakers. Thank you very much. I put in the chat, if this has whet people's appetites for more, you know, come and do an MA with us and you'll hear more from these 4 speakers as well as the other fantastic visiting fellows and lecturers that we have. And if you would like to know more about intelligence and security related events that go on within war studies, I've put in the chat the web address for our King's Intelligence and Security Group, and you can go onto that and you can sign up for mailing lists and updates. So let me leave everyone by saying thank you very much again for your time. You know, stay safe and all the rest of it. Enjoy the rest of the lockdown while you can, and hope to see you on the other side. Thanks very much. Cheers.